He spent his last $99 on an old container everyone else refused to touch. When they opened it and saw what was inside, people stepped back in fear. But he didn't. What he found that day changed everything. Watch until the end, subscribe for more stories, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Morning always came the same way for Walter Breen, slow and heavy, like a clock refusing to tick forward. He would wake before the light had fully reached his street, before the world began its noise. And for a few quiet minutes, the house felt as though it still held the breath of those who had once lived there. The kettle on the stove was old and rusted at the bottom. It hissed unevenly when he poured water into it. The floorboards groaned under his slippers. Dust floated in the air, caught in thin rays of dawn light filtering through the yellowed curtains. In the corner of the kitchen stood 2 chairs, though only one had been used for years. The walls of the house were covered with faint reminders of life that had passed through them. A faded photograph of a woman with soft eyes and hands that had once known every ache in his body, and another of a boy in a work uniform, his grin caught forever in black and white. Walter's wife had been gone for more than a decade, taken by a sudden stroke that had left him with a silence he could not fill. Their son had died only a few years later, falling from a construction scaffold. After that, Walter had stopped visiting anyone, stopped answering calls, stopped caring about much beyond the quiet rhythm of his own heartbeat. He lived on the edge of Cleveland, in a neighborhood where most of the houses had long since changed hands. The yards were different now, tidy lawns, cars with bright new plates, children he didn't recognize. He was a relic of a world that had been patched over and repainted. His pension was small, enough for bills and food, but every month it left him staring at the same question. What for? What was he still doing here, keeping a house meant for 3 people when the world had forgotten their names? Still, he had his routines. Every morning, he carried his coffee outside and sat on a wooden bench facing the railroad line that ran just beyond the trees. Freight trains passed twice before noon, and he would lift a hand out of habit, as if some old friend might see him. Sometimes, one of the engineers would wave back. That simple gesture, a brief movement of acknowledgement, had become the closest thing to human contact he experienced most weeks. He told himself he didn't mind the solitude, but in truth, he had learned to live inside it like an old coat that no longer fit, but was too familiar to discard. The evenings were the hardest. When darkness sank into the house, every sound grew louder. The hum of the refrigerator, the crack of settling wood, the faint whistle of a passing train. It was during one of those evenings that he decided to go into town, if only to see people and remind himself that he was not entirely invisible. The thrift store on the corner was one of the few places where time seemed to move at his pace. It smelled of metal and dust and old fabric. Walter often came there to look for small tools or a book he hadn't read. That afternoon, as he browsed the shelves, 2 men near the counter were talking loudly. "You should have seen it," one said. "Last time I got a storage unit for $200, filled with power tools. Sold half of it online." The other laughed. "Yeah, and someone else bought one full of urns. Creeped him right out." Walter pretended not to listen, but the words clung to him. Storage unit auctions, abandoned containers, forgotten things waiting for someone to claim them. On his way home, he stopped at the small diner near the rail tracks, bought a paper, and found the advertisement tucked between 2 columns of car listings. Unclaimed storage auction, Saturday, 10 a.m., Old Depot lot, industrial zone, entry fee $10. He read it several times. It wasn't that he needed money, though a little extra would help, but rather that he needed to do something, anything that might shake the dust from his days. At home that evening, he sat at the table under the weak glow of the lamp, staring at the notice. The numbers blurred, and for a while he thought of his wife, of how she used to laugh at his habit of taking small risks just for the story of it. He could almost hear her say, "Go on, Walt. What's the worst that could happen?" By morning, he had decided. He took his worn leather wallet, counted the bills inside, $100, the amount he'd been saving to fix the leaking roof, and folded them carefully into his jacket pocket. "The roof can wait," he muttered. "It's not like anyone else is getting wet." Saturday came cold and overcast. The industrial yard stretched out like a forgotten world. Cracked asphalt, leaning fences, rusted cranes long out of use. A handful of people stood in small groups, drinking coffee from thermoses, exchanging knowing jokes about their luck or lack thereof. Walter felt their glances when he walked in. An old man alone, his posture straight, but his steps uncertain. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man in a bright vest, stood on a wooden crate, calling out the rules and the numbers. One by one, the containers were opened. Some were filled with furniture and boxes, some nearly empty. The crowd reacted to each reveal with quick bids and laughter. When the auctioneer announced Lot 47, his tone changed. "This one's been sitting here for over 30 years, he said. "Nobody's claimed it. Came out of an old funeral service warehouse, they tell me. Might be junk, might be something strange. Who's feeling lucky?" A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. Someone snorted. "Not me. Keep that haunted crap." A few stepped back. Walter, standing a little apart, felt a strange tug of curiosity. He had faced real death more times than these people had likely imagined, first in hospitals, later in his own house. The thought of old funeral equipment didn't scare him. It intrigued him. The bidding began half-heartedly, one man offering 50, another 60. Then silence. Walter raised his hand. 99, he said. His voice was steady. The auctioneer looked around, waiting for a challenge. None came. "Sold to the gentleman in the red jacket," he declared, slamming the gavel against the crate. A few chuckles followed. "Hope you've got room for ghosts, old-timer." When the workers cut through the rusted lock and pried open the metal doors, a wave of stale air rushed out. The interior was dim, lit only by the gray morning light. At first glance, it looked empty, just shadows and wooden shapes. Then someone gasped. Inside stood 3 wooden coffins, lined in a row. The murmurs grew. Some people stepped closer to film it on their phones. Others retreated. Walter didn't move. He took a slow step forward, his breath fogging in the cold air. The coffins were beautiful in their own way, hand-carved with delicate borders, though age had darkened the wood and split the varnish. On each lid was a small brass plate, green with corrosion. There were no names, only dates. 1954, 1955, 1956. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Sir, we can issue a refund, if you'd rather not." "No," Walter interrupted softly. "I'll take it." "You sure?" "We can call disposal." "I said I'll take it." The crowd murmured again, a mix of amusement and discomfort. A man muttered, "Let him. He looks like he belongs in one anyway." But Walter didn't hear. His eyes were fixed on the dates, and something in them stirred a memory. The mid-50s, when his father had still been alive, working the rails. He brushed the dust from the nearest lid and nodded. It took the workers 2 hours to load the container onto a flatbed and haul it to his property. By the time they left, the sun was setting behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of copper and ash. The container sat at the edge of his yard, behind the tool shed, silent and heavy, like a visitor unwilling to leave. That night, Walter couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the shape of it under the streetlight. It didn't frighten him. He had stopped fearing anything long ago. But it filled him with a strange kind of wonder. Whoever had put those coffins there hadn't meant for them to be forgotten. There was a reason behind the secrecy, and he felt an urge to understand it. Rain began to fall softly, tapping against the glass. The smell of wet earth drifted through the half-open window. He thought of the hospital where his wife had spent her final days, how he had sat beside her, listening to the quiet rhythm of machines. Death, he'd realized then, wasn't a monster waiting in the dark. It was simply what remained when everything else had gone silent. He leaned back in his chair, staring into the shadows beyond the window. "It's just wood and nails," he whispered to himself. "Nothing more." But even as he said it, a small flicker of curiosity tightened in his chest. What if there was more? Not ghosts, not horror, but truth. Something left behind, deliberately hidden. Outside, the rain thickened. The sound of a distant freight train echoed through the night, the low rumble vibrating in his bones. For the first time in years, Walter felt that peculiar tension of anticipation, the kind that used to live in him when he was young, when he still believed that turning a corner could change everything. He watched the light glint off the wet metal of the container, and finally rose from his chair. Before going to bed, he pulled the curtains halfway closed, but left a small gap, enough to see it from where he slept. Lying in the dark, he whispered, "We'll see what you're hiding in the morning." The rain kept falling, steady and patient, as if counting the hours until dawn. And in the dim glow of the streetlight, the outline of the container remained, silent, waiting, holding its secrets in the quiet yard of an old man who had nothing left to lose. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the grass slick and shining under a pale layer of mist. Walter stood by the window for a long time before he stepped outside, his jacket already damp from the lingering fog. The air smelled of wet metal and soil. The container sat in the same place where the workers had left it, the paint chipped, the padlock removed, but hanging loosely as if still guarding something. He felt his heartbeat as he pulled the doors open again. The hinges groaned, their sound low and long, echoing through the yard like a reluctant sigh. Inside, everything was just as he had seen it, the 3 coffins aligned neatly, as if they had been placed there by someone who still believed in order, even in death. The light filtering through the clouds caught the dust in the air, turning it into a gray haze that shimmered faintly. For a moment, Walter simply stood and looked. He had faced many strange sights in his life, but this one carried a gravity that words couldn't describe. He ran a hand over the nearest coffin. The wood was smooth but dry, cracked by decades of heat and cold. With slow care, he slipped the tip of a screwdriver under the edge of the lid and lifted. The smell that escaped was not of decay, but of time itself. Paper, cloth, and oil. What lay inside was not a body, but a carefully arranged collection of personal things. A workman's gloves, a rusted wrench, an old lunchbox, a tin of matches, and a small stack of folded letters tied with a string. Every item looked deliberately placed, not discarded. It was as if someone had meant for this coffin to be a capsule, a record of an existence that had refused to vanish quietly. The second coffin was harder to open. The lid had swollen with moisture. When it finally gave, Walter was stunned again. There were photographs, dozens of them, stacked in boxes and envelopes. A rolled-up flag lay beside them, a railway union flag, faded but intact. Beneath it, a small cardboard box contained medals, a pocket watch, and a folded note that read, in shaky handwriting, "If you find this, don't throw it away. We built this city. Let someone remember." Walter sat on an overturned bucket for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. His breath came slow, controlled. He had no reason to feel this wave of emotion, but it washed through him nonetheless. The third coffin was lighter. When he opened it, he found it nearly empty. A single child's shoe rested near one corner, its leather stiff and discolored, and beside it, wrapped in a strip of cloth, an old flag, the same railway emblem as the one before, only smaller, as though it had been folded for a burial that never came. He touched the cloth and felt an inexplicable pull, a connection that reached beyond logic. He spent the next hour cataloging everything he found. By the time he finished, the mist had lifted and the weak sunlight spread across the yard. He carried some of the items inside and laid them out carefully on the kitchen table. The photographs drew him in first. Men in heavy work clothes, their faces lined and proud, stood before half-finished rail tracks and scaffolding. In one photo, a group of them posed beside a locomotive labeled Cleveland Central. The image was yellowed, but the eyes of the men seemed alive, full of endurance and something like hope. Then he saw it, a face near the edge of one photo that made him freeze, the jawline, the posture, the familiar squint against the sun. He leaned closer, his heart thudding against his ribs. The man looked just like his father. For a few seconds, Walter could only stare. His father, Harold Breen, had died in 1956 in an accident at the Cleveland Depot site. He had been told all his life that it was a simple construction mishap, an explosion caused by a gas leak. There had been no investigation, no memorial, just a short obituary in the paper and a folded flag given to his mother. Walter had been 12. Now, staring at this photo, he realized the setting matched the old depot site exactly. The same cranes, the same unfinished arches, and beside his father stood two other men whose names he didn't know, though on the back of the photograph someone had written in pencil, Joe, Leonard, Harold. Shift 7. May 1956. He felt something shift inside him, something old and heavy. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was the sudden, burning sense that his father's story wasn't finished, that someone had sealed it away and hoped it would be forgotten. The coffins, the photos, the letters, they weren't the remnants of strangers. They were witnesses. He spent the afternoon reading through the letters. Most were written in a rough, hurried hand. They spoke of unsafe conditions, complaints ignored, supervisors warning the men to keep silent about cracks in the support arches. Some letters were signed with initials, some with full names. A few ended abruptly, as if the writer had never gotten to finish the page. One folder held blueprints, folded and stained. Walter spread them out under the kitchen light. They showed a tunnel beneath the depot, with marked sections labeled unstable and pending inspection. Someone had circled one area in red and scribbled beside it, "Don't pour concrete until we reinforce." The date was June 16, 1956, 3 days before the explosion. The air in the kitchen felt colder. He ran his fingers over the paper, tracing the red ink, imagining his father's hands doing the same. The realization came slowly but unmistakably. The collapse had not been an accident. It had been negligence, maybe worse, and someone had gone to great lengths to erase it. When darkness fell, he still hadn't eaten. He sat by the table, surrounded by the objects that now felt sacred. For the first time in years, his mind was awake, sharp, and filled with purpose. He remembered how his father used to tell him stories about the rails, how men poured their lives into the iron and stone, how every bolt and beam carried someone's sweat. When you build something, his father had said once, you leave your name in it, even if no one carves it there. Walter stood and looked toward the window. The yard outside was black, the container barely visible. He felt that same quiet pulse of anticipation that had stirred in him the night before. Only now, it was stronger, heavier with meaning. There was something more to find. The next morning, he drove to the city library. It had been years since he'd walked under those tall windows, the smell of old paper instantly familiar. He requested access to the archives, and after an hour of waiting, a young librarian brought out a reel of microfilm labeled Cleveland Central Construction Records, 1955-1956. He threaded it into the reader and began to scroll. The headlines were faint, some words missing where the film had cracked. Then he saw it. Depot collapse kills 3 workers. Company declines comment. The article named no victims, offered no follow-up. Just a single paragraph buried on page 6. He searched the following week's papers. Nothing. It was as if the event had been erased overnight. He leaned back, his eyes dry and burning, and whispered, "You built this city, and they buried you under it." As he left the library, the wind had picked up. He passed by the town square where the fountain was still running, spraying water that caught the afternoon light. People walked by him without notice. He wanted to stop them, tell them that their city rested on a lie, that beneath the pavement there were men whose names had been taken away. But he said nothing. Not yet. That night, while sorting through another box of photographs, he found a small reel of magnetic tape. A label was glued to the side. Shift 7, June 1956. His breath caught. He hadn't seen a reel-to-reel tape since he was a boy, but he knew exactly what it was. He drove back into town the next morning and convinced the librarian to let him use the old playback machine stored in the basement. The first seconds of sound were just static and faint clicks. Then came voices, muffled but distinct. Men talking over the hum of machinery. Told them the supports are cracked. If they pour concrete over it, it'll collapse. Orders from above. They want it done before inspection. We don't stop until they say, stop. A pause. Then another voice, firm and familiar. That's suicide. I'm not signing off on it. Walter's hand trembled on the volume knob. The voice was his father's. The tape went on for another minute, the words growing fainter, ending with a sudden roar. Maybe the start of the collapse, maybe the sound of the recorder dropping. Then silence. Walter sat back, staring at the spinning reel as it slowed to a stop. The room felt too small to hold what he had just heard. He realized his father's last words had been recorded not for fame or safety, but for truth. A truth that no one had wanted to hear. When he returned home that evening, the world seemed sharper, louder. The creak of the porch boards, the hiss of wind through the gutters. Everything carried a strange clarity. He laid out the tape, the photos, and the letters again, now knowing they weren't random relics, but pieces of a buried confession. He barely noticed the hours passing. The sky darkened, and the kitchen filled with the smell of cold coffee and dust. Somewhere in the distance a train wailed, long and mournful. Walter looked toward the sound, imagining his father's hands gripping steel, his voice shouting over the noise of the worksite. "Don't sign it," the voice on the tape had said. "Let truth live longer than us." He thought of the irony. His father had been silenced by the very structure he'd tried to save, but his words had survived, locked away in a coffin that someone hid to keep them safe. Maybe those men, Joe and Leonard, had known what they were risking when they sealed the containers. Maybe they had believed someone, someday, would find them. Walter felt both grief and gratitude. He had spent years searching for a reason to keep going, and now it had come to him, uninvited, but undeniable. He could not let this stay buried. Later that night, he sat again by the window. The rain had returned, tapping softly on the glass. The container outside looked smaller now, less ominous, as if it had given up its secrets willingly. He imagined the men who had placed the coffins there, working quickly, afraid but determined to preserve something that mattered. They hadn't been trying to hide death. They had been trying to protect truth. He whispered into the quiet room, "I'll tell them, Dad. I'll tell them everything." He didn't sleep that night. He made lists, names, dates, places. He gathered every photograph, every letter, labeling them with trembling precision. When dawn came, he brewed a pot of coffee and watched the sky lighten through the curtains. The first chapter of his life had closed long ago without his consent. But this was a beginning. He would go to the city hall, to the newspapers, to anyone who would listen. Someone had to give those men back their names. As the sun rose, its light fell on the stack of papers spread across the table. The ink glinted faintly, as if the past itself were coming up for air after too many years underground. And in that pale morning glow, Walter Breen, once a man with nothing left, finally knew what he was meant to do. He straightened the photos, tucked the tape into his pocket, and looked once more toward the silent container outside. For the first time since he bought it, he smiled. The next sound he heard was the whistle of a train moving across the tracks beyond the trees, low and steady, carrying the promise of motion forward, a promise he intended to keep. The morning came with a sharp wind that bent the branches and filled the street with dry leaves. Walter stood by the window again, watching the gray light spread across his yard. The container was still there, but now it seemed like a monument rather than a mystery. The discovery from the night before had changed everything. The voices on the tape were still echoing in his mind, his father's voice above them all, calm but resolute, refusing to sign the false report. The thought of that final moment, the courage it took to say no, made Walter's chest ache with something close to pride. He had spent years trying not to feel anything at all, but now the past had found him, and it demanded to be heard. He had not slept. Instead, he spent the early hours organizing the documents and photographs, spreading them across his kitchen table like a map. The tape lay at the center, the reel glinting under the light. Next to it, he placed the letters and the blueprint, showing the red circle around the cracked arch. Every piece was a fragment of a truth, buried under 50 years of silence. He knew what he had to do next. By 9 o'clock, he was in his truck, the boxes secured in the back seat. The road into the city was longer than he remembered, but the familiar landmarks brought back memories, old diners, half-collapsed barns, the rusted water tower that used to gleam in the sun when he was a boy. He drove past the rail line, and for a moment, he imagined his father walking along those same tracks, carrying his lunch pail, unaware that his story would one day be silenced by the same industry he gave his life to. City Hall was a square concrete building, practical and unwelcoming. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A young clerk at the reception desk looked up at him with polite confusion when he asked for the municipal records department. She directed him to the third floor without much interest, her fingers already returning to her keyboard. Walter took the elevator and stepped into a hallway that smelled of dust and paper. He stopped at a door labeled Archives. Inside, behind a desk piled with files, sat a woman in her 30s, typing rapidly on a computer. She looked up when he entered. "Can I help you?" she asked. He explained who he was, that he had found materials related to the 1956 Cleveland Depot collapse. Her expression didn't change much. She leaned back, arms crossed. "That was a long time ago," she said. "I'm not sure we have anything on file anymore." "I know you don't," he said quietly. "That's the problem. They erased it." Something in his voice made her hesitate. She asked him to wait and disappeared into a back room. When she returned, she carried a small, brittle folder. "This is all that's left. Just an incident report, no names, no follow-up. Looks like the company handled the rest privately." Walter opened the folder. It was empty except for a single typed page, a brief note confirming 3 casualties, no mention of causes. He looked up. "Who keeps the older records, before things went digital?" She frowned. "There's a retired archivist, Harrison. He worked here until about 10 years ago. If anyone remembers something, it'd be him. She gave him an address on a yellow slip of paper. Walter thanked her and left. Harrison lived in a narrow 2-story house at the edge of town, half hidden behind overgrown hedges. The old man who opened the door had white hair and eyes that were both wary and curious. When Walter introduced himself and mentioned the depot, a flicker of recognition passed over his face. He invited Walter inside. The house smelled of old books and pipe smoke. Stacks of papers filled the coffee table, and the wallpaper was peeling. Harrison poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs and sat opposite him. "You're the first person to mention that collapse in decades," he said. "What brought it up?" Walter placed the photo of the 3 men on the table, then the letters, then the tape. "I bought an abandoned container at an auction," he said. "Found these inside. One of those men was my father." Harrison stared at the photograph for a long moment. "Good Lord," he whispered. "They told me to seal those files, said the families had been compensated, that reopening it would only hurt people." "Hurt people?" Walter repeated. "They lied. Those men died because someone ordered them to work in unsafe conditions." The old archivist nodded slowly. "We knew something wasn't right. But back then, well, you didn't question the people with power. The construction company folded within a year. The executives moved on, started another firm under a different name. The city wanted it forgotten." Walter felt the anger rising in him, not the wild, consuming anger of youth, but a deep, steady fire. "Then we'll make them remember," he said. "All of them." Harrison hesitated, then leaned forward. "If you're serious, I can help. I still know a journalist, young fellow named Michael Berry. Works for the Cleveland Gazette. He's one of the few who still cares about stories like this." He scribbled a number on the back of an envelope and handed it over. "Tell him Harrison sent you." The next day, Walter found himself sitting across from Michael Berry in a small newsroom that smelled of ink and coffee. The journalist couldn't have been more than 30, his shirt sleeves rolled up, hair messy. When Walter started to explain, Michael listened with the polite skepticism of someone used to hearing wild tales. But as soon as Walter placed the tape recorder on the table and pressed play, everything changed. The voices filled the room, the argument, the mention of the cracks, the warning, the final defiance. When the recording ended, silence stretched between them. Michael exhaled slowly. "This is unbelievable," he said. "If this is real, it's not just a story, it's history, and a cover-up." "It's real," Walter said. "You can have the tape, the letters, the photos, but I want their names back, all 3 of them. My father, and the 2 men who died with him." Michael nodded. "You'll have it. I'll make sure people know." Over the next weeks, the story unfolded across the city. The first article ran on the front page. Retired worker uncovers evidence of 1956 depot cover-up. The photograph of the coffins taken discreetly by Michael during one of his visits accompanied the headline. Inside, the article detailed the discovery, the tape, the letters, and the names of the 3 men who had been erased from history. The response was immediate. Families of former railway workers came forward with fragments of memory, an uncle who never came home, a father whose death was never explained. Reporters flooded the town archives. The mayor's office issued a statement promising to review historical safety records, though everyone knew that was political language for damage control. Through it all, Walter kept to the background. He didn't seek attention or interviews. He met with Michael only to provide facts. Yet each morning, when he saw the newspapers at the store counter, his chest filled with quiet satisfaction. For the first time in decades, his father's name was in print again. Harold Breen, no longer just a line in a forgotten report, but a man who had tried to save others. Then came the call from City Hall. The council had voted to establish a memorial near the old depot site. They wanted Walter to attend the unveiling. He hesitated, uncertain whether he was ready to face the place where everything had ended. But on the day of the ceremony, he dressed in his cleanest shirt, brushed the dust from his jacket, and drove into town. The sky was heavy with clouds. A small crowd had gathered: families, local officials, workers in reflective vests. Michael was there with his notebook. Harrison stood near the front, leaning on a cane. When Walter approached, people turned to look at him, some nodding in recognition. He didn't know most of them, but he saw gratitude in their eyes. A wooden platform had been built beside the remains of the depot wall. On it stood a new plaque covered with a dark cloth. The mayor gave a short speech about courage and sacrifice, words that drifted into the cold air and disappeared. When the cloth was pulled away, the engraved letters gleamed in the gray light. In memory of the workers of Cleveland Central Depot, 1956, Harold Breen, Leonard Hayes, Joseph Carter. Their work built this city. Their truth endures. The crowd applauded quietly. Walter stood still, his hat held against his chest. For a long time he said nothing. He didn't cry, though his eyes burned. He only stared at the names until the lines blurred. The sound of a passing train rolled through the distance, low and solemn, as if the earth itself acknowledged the moment. After the ceremony, some people came to shake his hand. Reporters tried to speak with him, but he politely declined. He thanked Harrison and Michael, then walked toward the edge of the site, where the old concrete foundation still jutted from the ground. He placed his hand on it, feeling the rough texture under his palm. "It's done, Dad," he murmured. "They know now." The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of rain. Somewhere far off, thunder grumbled. He thought of the coffin still sitting in his yard, no longer a secret, but part of a story that would outlive him. They would be moved soon, cleaned, and placed under glass in the local museum. Not as a curiosity, but as proof. When he returned home that evening, the sky was already darkening. The container stood empty now. The artifacts had been taken for preservation, yet the sight of it still gave him comfort. It had brought him back to life in a way he hadn't expected. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the lights flicker on across the neighborhood. The silence in the house no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like peace. On the table lay a letter from the Historical Society, thanking him for his remarkable contribution to the city's heritage. He read it once, smiled faintly, and placed it beside his father's photograph. The two faces, one in print, one in glass, seemed to watch each other across time. Outside, another freight train passed, its whistle long and steady. Walter listened until the sound faded. For years he had sat by that window feeling forgotten, but now he knew that nothing truly vanished. Not work, not memory, not love. They only waited, patient and buried, until someone had the courage to open the door and let them speak again. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, the steady rhythm of the rails humming faintly in his mind. He had found no gold, no fortune in that container. But what he had found was rarer, the truth that his father had died for, the purpose he himself had been missing. The years of silence had finally been broken. The dead had spoken, and he had listened. When the night settled completely, Walter rose and turned off the lamp. The window reflected his face faintly against the dark yard beyond. For the first time in many years, he did not see an old man staring back at him, but someone who had fulfilled a promise long overdue. The train's echo faded into the distance, leaving behind the soft, endless hum of a city, finally remembering its own heart. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Check out the other stories on the channel. Every one of them hides something worth discovering. And if you know someone who'd feel this one like you did, share the video with them. Let's keep these stories alive together.